Hello and welcome back. The last three methods we're going to look at are all types of interviews. Before defining each of them, in this video, we're going to talk about some of the possibilities that interviews open up for researchers. In particular, the fact that during an interview, the researcher is able to generate new or spontaneous questions. We'll see that the three different methods of types of interviews that we're looking at all distinguish themselves in terms of the extent that they allow for interview-generated questions. I said that if a researcher is present when the participant is responding, it's an interview. The researcher can be present either in person, by telephone, or by video conference. Key for interviews is that the researcher and participants are accessible to each other while the participant is responding. Because they are present, the researcher can clarify instructions or address any confusions around the questions being asked. They can address any problems the person has in responding to the questions. For example, any technical difficulties they might have. Being there also likely encourages higher rates of participation. In my experience, people are less likely to leave in the middle of an interview than they would be, for example, when completing an online survey. Another key advantage is that if the researcher is present, they can ask the questions. We often hold in high regard and even make celebrities of people whose main job is to ask questions. Think of your favorite reporter, talk show host, podcaster, etc. One reason that we hold these people in such high regard is that a good interviewer can get the respondent to share more and present a richer story. From a research point of view, how the researcher asks questions can encourage longer engagement and richer responses. For example, the researcher can sense someone may need more time and pause to allow the respondent to add to their response. Or they can sense that the participant is getting bored, so that the researcher should speed up the questions. During an interview, the researcher can adjust the wording of questions. This can be done either unconsciously or when they think it's appropriate because of the person being interviewed or how the interview is proceeding. While adjusting question wording across different interviews introduces a level of variation, it is also likely more sensitive to the situation and the person being interviewed. It can also result in richer responses. Similarly, because they are asking the questions, the researcher can alter the order of questions during the interview. They can even skip questions if they feel they've been sufficiently addressed in the previous responses. But we don't celebrate our favorite interviewer just because they change the wording or the order of the predetermined questions. Their main skill comes from generating questions while the interview is ongoing. In the same way, researchers can generate questions during an interview. These questions are more spontaneous. They're not formulated in advance. Generating questions while talking is not a shocking idea. When having a conversation with someone, we usually don't come with a fixed list of predetermined questions. Rather, we listen to the conversation and think of the questions to ask in response. Surveys force the researcher to determine what's going to be relevant in advance, and likely stick with that determination across the whole study. Allowing questions that are not set in advance opens the scope of the discussion. It allows you as a researcher to build on what you've already learned. It's also only possible during an interview. As an interview progresses, the researcher can determine what is relevant to ask next. What a researcher sees as relevant to ask during the interview is likely not wholly known at the start of the study or even at the beginning of an interview. It is based on the researcher's judgment in the moment. But it's not just that the questions are spontaneous, the question is also often appropriate to ask given the circumstances. Interview-sensitive questions are questions that arrive during an interview that reflect the researcher's consideration of what is relevant to find out for the study and appropriate to ask at that moment. For interview-sensitive questions, the researcher considers a number of things. They are sensitive to what they've already discovered from previous interviews, how the conversation is unfolding, the emotional cues of the participant, the responses they've given, and other factors. Interview-sensitive questions can be reflective of a lot of considerations. The researcher needs to appreciate what still needs to be known in their investigation and sensitive to how the interview is going. Interview-sensitive questions require an engaged interviewer. They're curiosity-driven. They allow the researcher to respond to unexpected turns in the interview and follow where the conversation goes. This freedom to follow the conversation may seem loose and unscientific, but for a researcher who wants to explore a topic, there's often great value following what seems relevant to ask based on what arises during the interview, rather than relying solely on what you thought would be important, sometimes well before the interview started. Interview-sensitive questions feel more natural, as they develop more like questions would in a normal conversation. These types of questions allow you to explore more the unique knowledge and experiences of the person you're talking with, and better engage with the story they're telling you. In the final video in this playlist, I'm going to show you how structured, semi-structured, and unstructured interviews differ from each other in how they each use predetermined and during interview generated questions. Thank you for watching.